皆さん、こんにちは。私は福岡アメリカンセンター館長のマイケル・チャドウィックです。本日は皆さんお忙しい中、ご来場いただき、誠にありがとうございます。本日の講演会は、アメリカ大統領図書館の歴史と役割について、アメリカ全土に13カ所ある大統領図書館の管理、運営のしているアメリカ国立公文書館のシャロン・ファセットさんにお話ししていただきます。アメリカでは大統領図書館は政治、歴史に興味のある研究者だけでなく、子供から大人までアメリカ人、外国人もいいですけど、皆さんに、訪れる博物館のような教育施設の役割も果たしています。大統領図書館にはまたアーカイブとしてその大統領に関する資料を保存、管理し、市民のために一般公開の役割もしています。今日の出席者の中には4月に開校した九州大学大学院ライブラリーサイエンス専攻の学生さんがいます。この中には将来のアーカイビストとして活躍される方もいらっしゃるでしょう。九州大学大学院ライブラリーサイエンス専攻関係者の皆様、大学附属図書館、大学文書館の皆様、本日は開催にご協力いただきまして誠にありがとうございます。本日は九州大学記録資料館館長、そしてライブラリーサイエンス専攻でも教えていらっしゃる三輪教授に司会役をお願いいたしました。それでは三輪先生、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
九州大学記録資料館の三輪です。私は声が大きいからこの役割を仰せつかえたんだなと思ってましたら、声の大きさ関係ないみたいで、通訳にはこちらで特別な装置で音声が送られているので、声は全く関係ないということでした。冗談はそれぐらいしまして、今日は録画をしております。それで皆さんのお顔は映らないようにしておりますのでご安心ください。どうしても顔を放送してほしいという人はどうぞ私の隣に来てお座りいただければと思います。私の顔は美男子なもんですからどんどん放映していただこうと思っているんですけれども、あれですね、あんまり私ばかり話すと止まらなくなりますもんですから、これぐらいにいたしまして、今日はですね、最初にですねライブラリーサイエンスの専攻長ですね、九州大学ライブラリー専攻の専攻長の岡崎先生の方からですね簡単に今日の趣旨説明とかその辺の説明をしていただこうと思いますので、岡崎先生よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さんこんにちは。九州大学大学院統合新領域学府ライブラリーサイエンス専攻専攻長の岡崎敦と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。本日はアメリカ国立公文書館大統領図書館のシャロン・ファセット局長をお迎えしての講演会を開催いたしますことは、私どもにとって大変名誉なことであると存じます。ファセット局長には未曾有の大震災の影響が心配される中、来日をご英断いただいたことに改めて御礼申し上げるとともに、深い敬意を表す次第であります。今回ファセット局長はアメリカ合衆国独特の制度であります大統領図書館に関する連続講演の一環として来日されました。23日の東京を皮切りに名古屋、大阪と日本を南下され、本日の福岡での講演が、連続講演会の締めくくりとなります。ところで福岡での講演会は他の講演会とは異なる趣旨を帯びております。福岡アメリカンセンターに加えて九州大学附属図書館並びに大学院統合新領域学部ライブラリーサイエンス専攻が主催者として名を連ねているからです。九州大学はちょうど本年100周年を迎えます。旧帝国大学の一つとして創立されて以来、日本の近代化を支える高等教育研究の領域において重要な貢献を続けてまいりました。とりわけ近年においては資料や情報管理の分野で日本の大学をリードいたしています。例えば 付属図書館、大学図書館における研究組織の設置、あるいは大学アーカイブズ、これらいずれも日本の国立大学の中で初めての試みでありました。そして本年2011年4月に急速に進行いたします情報化の対応を念頭に置きながら、図書館情報学とアーカイブズ学、記録管理学の統合を起といたしまして、新しい大学院専攻を設置いたしました。九州大学大学院ライブラリサイエンス専攻の特徴は以下の書点にまとめられます。第1は、日本で初めて図書館情報学、アーカイブズ学、記録管理学を統合という観点から教育することです。ご存知のように、これらの領域は従来、対象や方法論の面で非常に異なっておりました。しかしながら、近年は情報学の飛躍的な発展、あるいは資料の法的、政治的、あるいは社会的な性格の流動化などの側面から、理由から、情報管理をキーワードとして融合する方向にあります。第2は、資料、情報管理を単に収集や保存だけではなくて、利用者や資料を生み出す組織の戦略的な活用を包含するものとして理解することです。簡単に申せば、資料や情報管理機関の存在意義は、これからますますそのサービスの機能に依存するであろうと考えている次第です。最後に、私たちは資料、情報管理の刷新をさまざまな領域に波及させていきたいと考えています。例えば、大学の教育改革の最も重要な要素として図書館を再定義すること、あるいは大学のコンプライアンス、あるいはアイデンティティの構築の必須の手段としてアーカイブズを考えていくということであります。ところで、本日のご講演のテーマであるアメリカ合衆国大統領図書館は、現在の日本にとって特別な意味を帯びているように思われます。3月11日に生じた大地震と津波、原子力発電所の被災等に対する政府、地方自治体、企業等の対応は、まさに記録や情報の管理という点で、日本の社会が非常に大きな問題を抱えているということを改めて明らかにしていると言えるからです。19世紀の半ば、アメリカ合衆国の施設によって海外への門戸を開いた日本は、その後、西洋文明の急速な模倣と吸収によって近代化を進めてまいりました。が、ご存知のとおり、2つだけ長らく無視していたものがあります。一つは実はオペラ劇場でありますが、今一つがアーカイブズでありました。オペラ劇場はともかくとして、近代日本国家がアーカイブズを長らく拒否してきたということは、公的な記録や情報をきちんと管理し、市民に提供するという、言ってみれば民主主義の根幹が無視され続けてきたということを示すものなのかもしれません。本日のファセット局長のご講演が、いわば合衆国による日本に対する第二の開国要請とも言えるものとなりましょうか。今一つ、現代日本のアーカイブズに関連して指摘したいことがあります。長らくアーカイブズを持たなかった日本では、これに代わって図書館や博物館等の施設がとりわけ歴史資料の収集や管理の役割を担ってまいりました。しかしながら、結果としてアーカイブズ資料が一部の愛好家のコレクションの対象とみなされ、民主主義の土台となる公共的な共有財産であるという認識が不十分なままとなっているように思われます。しかしながら、流動化する現代世界において、改めて国民や国家の在り方が再検討される中、アーカイブズ資料を公権力のチェックや市民の利害調整のみならず、市民や組織のアイデンティティの生殺のための重要な材料として、むしろ積極的に位置づける動きが近年多く見られます。日本の多くの旧国立大学が現在アーカイブズを設けつつある背景には、独立行政法人の結果、組織体としてのアイデンティティの確立を必須の課題としているからでありましょう。この意味で、合衆国の大統領図書館は、狭い意味でのアーカイブズ資料のみならず、多種多様な資料を総合的に取り扱っている施設として、その特殊性が改めて再認識されるべきではないかとも思われます。この貴重な機会が合衆国と日本の友好関係の強化とともに、今日の日本社会の再検討にもつながればと期待いたしております。最後になりましたが、本日の講演会開催に関して、 多大なるご尽力をいただきました皆様に改めて深く御礼申し上げます。本日はよろしくお願いいたします。
再び司会の私がここに前戻ってきたんですけど、私話好きなもんですから一つまた話を入れさせてください。私 FDR フランクリン・D・ルーズベルト大統領図書館に3回ほど行きました。で最初行った時ですね、大雪に見舞われまして、それで夜中のですね2時頃ですねプーケプシーの駅に着きました。それで困ったなと思ってですね、タクシーをようやく捕まえてですね、それからホテル予約してたホテル行ったんですね。行ってびっくり、ホテルが閉まってるじゃありませんか。もう真っ青になりましたね。たまたまですねチェーンホテルが1軒空いてまして、そこにですねもうドアをノックしたらドアが開きましてですね、泊まることができたんですね。もうそれが最初の経験でしたね。それかあまりもうこれ以上話すと良くないもんですからこれぐらいにしておきますけど、ファセットさんはですね津波や地震を恐れずですね、わざわざこのはるばるワシントン DC から来ていただきました。それで現在の職はですね大統領図書館局長ということだそうで、ワシントン DC におられます。で略歴がですね皆さんにお配りしたものに書いてありますのでそちらをお読みいただければと思います。それぐらいにして私がもうお話し出すと止まらなくなりますのでこれをもっと話したいんですけど、これぐらいに打ち切ってですね、ファスさんよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you so much. It's such an honor for me to be here in Japan, tsunami or not. Back in our country, we've been having a lot of tornadoes, so I'm happy to escape those. It's wonderful to be here on this 100th anniversary year of Kyushu University, so thank you indeed for having me. I was honored this afternoon to meet with some students from the Graduate School of Library Science, and I am so thrilled that you have an integrated program of library science and archival and records management. There are only 3 or 4 programs in the United States that do this, and it's such an important field now in managing records. And as we learned the importance of records, in fact, we have a banner that hangs in front of the National Archives, and it says, "Records matter." They matter to our democracy, and I hope that this presentation today about presidential libraries will show you a little bit about what our mission is and why I think we are such an asset to the American people. The libraries themselves, though, often face certain controversies. After all, a presidential library is a place that bears the president's name. So it often raises questions about the issues of history, legacy, and politics, and it can drive many of the controversies and criticisms that can swirl around these presidential libraries. But modern politics aside, there's always been controversy about presidents. I can go back to Andrew Jackson, whose role in moving the Indians from their lands to other lands is very controversial in American history. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. What was that? Woodrow Wilson had a stroke while he was in office, and his wife was actually running the government. So I think when we answer the question, as we are going to look at it today, what are we purveyors of public history, or are we too invested in the legacy of our presidents? In the 15 years that I have managed the presidential libraries, they've grown from a group of individual libraries to a system of libraries that house some of our most significant historical records. At the same time, they have each maintained their own individual identity and uniqueness and reflect the president himself. I think of Franklin Roosevelt, who our speaker has been to his home, the Hudson Valley, which is very, very beautiful. LBJ came from the hill country in Texas, and it was a very hard-scrabble existence that he led, and I think that formed some of his policies later about wanting to help the poor and impoverished. And Eisenhower, who came from the heart of America and really represented the heartland of our country. And Gerald Ford, whose libraries were divided across the state, much as the politics of the state itself. I've voted in every presidential election so far in our country since I was eligible to vote. It's about 11 elections, but my candidate only won in about half of the elections. So, you know, I have a 50% record. But to me, a presidential library is not about the party or partisanship views of the individual who served. The libraries are about the American people, the issues that have been important to each generation, the times we have witnessed or learned about, and the men, at least so far, whom we have elected to office. Even if Americans do not identify with the views held and the actions taken by Bill Clinton or George Bush or whoever, many others have. And that is the heart of our system of government. If we do nothing else in our presidential libraries, I hope we can teach civility in discourse and empathy for other views, both in the U.S. and around the world. What is a presidential library? I think you heard a little bit about it in the introduction. I think the name libraries is a misnomer. In truth, these are presidential archives, not libraries, which also contain museums and exhibits related to the particular chief executives. The U.S. is the only country in the world to have opted in favor of sustaining a system of libraries that has been legislated into law and practice. Now, why are they called libraries? Someone asked that question earlier today of me, and I believe it's because presidential archival depositories is pretty awkward, and presidents felt presidential library was much more dignified a term. Our presidential libraries now constitute a defined component in the legacy of our modern presidents. Put simply, the libraries themselves are constructed with funds provided by supporters of each president, after which they are funded by annual stipends provided by the U.S. Congress and managed by the National Archives. It all began about 71 years ago when Franklin Roosevelt proposed creating the first presidential libraries to house his papers, his many collections and gifts accumulated during his administration. On this slide, you see original display of the president's collection of ship models. Now, today, all those ship models are stored in the storage rooms because the exhibits have changed considerably, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. To make the library happen, FDR donated a piece of land near his Hyde Park home and created a foundation to build the library. President Roosevelt even sketched out the design of the building, a Dutch colonial building featuring local bluestone. This, in fact, I guess, made him the first architect of a presidential library. President Roosevelt dedicated his library in 1941 to future generations as war threatened democracy in Europe. This became the model for presidential libraries. Libraries were built with private funds and then turned over to the government to operate. Most of all, it is crucially important to recognize the pivotal role played by President Roosevelt in projecting the values of democracy through highlighting the importance of archival accessibility, or in today's parlance, openness and transparency. Oddly, though, at the same time, presidents personally owned their records, and there had not been a National Archives established in our country until 1937. So we didn't have a history of archival access to records at that time. But Roosevelt thought it was important, so he donated his papers to the government to make them available. The fact that presidents own their own papers was a tradition that began with George Washington, our first president, who, when he left office, took several wagon loads of records back to Mount Vernon. It was not until 1978 that Congress passed the Presidential Records Act, which asserted government ownership of the records and made them available to Freedom of Information Act requests. One difference between FDR and all the other presidential libraries is that he was the only president to have his library built while he was still in office. And this is another gallery of the FDR exhibit. I think this is a gallery of images of President Roosevelt, and everyone loves the pyramid in the middle. The role of the libraries has changed since FDR first built his library. He wanted the American people to be able to see the many collections that he had gathered throughout his life. He was quite a collector. He collected ship models, which you've seen, naval and maritime art, New Deal art, cars, stamps, rare books, stuffed birds, butterflies, and folk and fine art given to the Roosevelts by ordinary people. So this exhibit in the early museum was not about the public life and work of the president. As changes were made to the museum beginning in the 1950s, new exhibits were installed that focused on the historical times and life of the Roosevelts, and libraries followed the new tradition of historical timelines, and many of these artifacts which have been on display went into storage. I want to talk a moment about the kind of collections in presidential libraries. This section is entitled Terabytes, Media, Paper, and Artifacts. Presidential library collections represent only a small percentage of the holdings of the National Archives. Of all the traditional, meaning the paper records and the photographs, the traditional holdings of the National Archives, it's only 7% of the total holdings of the National Archives. But the importance of the records is the fact that 60% of the Foreign Relations of the United States series comes from presidential collections. 90% of the National Archives' current holdings of electronic records are presidential records. That's over 1 billion pages if we printed them out. Now, the total number of paper pages in the National Archives to date is 9 billion pages. So you can see what the nature of electronic records has done to our record keeping. And then we hold 99% of the artifacts in the National Archives. And that's because really most of the National Archives is not a museum. And we have a small museum in the National Archives, but we're not an artifact holding agency. Most of the artifacts of interest in our country end up at the Smithsonian Institution. I want to give you some examples of our holdings that might be meaningful to the audience. This is a photograph of President and Mrs. Bush on their flight to Japan in 2002. The Bush administration was the first administration to completely abandon analog media. All photos and all video in the Bush Library are digital. This created enormous files for transfer at the end of the administration. Other problems with the transfer included the proprietary use of software. So when the White House used a software system called Merlin, we were not able to take that system into our archives until we actually bought the proprietary software. These are two more pictures from the Bush Library. This is President Bush with the Prime Minister, and on the right are President and Mrs. Bush with the Emperor and Empress. This is in 2002. And these three photographs are three of more than 3 million digital images from the George W. Bush Library. I think he must have been photographed every second of his presidency. Presidential libraries also contain foreign official gifts and other artifacts. This happens to be a gift from the Prime Minister to George Bush, and I don't read Japanese, and so my curators told me that it said, "The arrow to defeat the evil and bring peace on earth." And after my first presentation, they told me that's not what it said. That it basically, I think, indicates that it's a presentation from the Prime Minister to George Bush. And I believe that the phrase that I thought was on it is probably on the reverse side. So when I go back home, I'm going to tell my curators that they were wrong. But this is one of 4,000 gifts from heads of state and officials in the George W. Bush Library. Now, under the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act in the U.S., these gifts come to the National Archives for deposit in the Presidential Library. The presidents can only keep gifts valued at less than $270. Otherwise, he would have to purchase the gift from the federal government if he were to be allowed to do so. And for example, we wouldn't let him purchase this gift because it's a valued item of antiquity and it's a very unique item. If the Prime Minister gave him a Rolex watch and he wanted to buy it, we would probably let him buy the Rolex watch. All total, in the 13 presidential libraries, foreign and domestic gifts of the presidential memorabilia total over 650,000 artifacts. Now these include incredibly priceless pieces of antiquity like this, jewelry, oh the jewelry, incredible, diamonds, emeralds, etc., weaponry, along with boots, saddles, golf clubs, dog houses, dolls, portraits, quilts, t-shirts, baseball hats, plaques, and more. They very much represent the interests of the president. President Bush has lots of saddles and boots. President Clinton had lots of saxophones and golf clubs. In the future, we are working right now on making digital images of all of our artifacts so they can be put up online for institutions to look at in order to borrow them and for researchers and scholars to study them. Now, for many years, presidential libraries, while a part of the National Archives, existed almost as standalone institutions, their collections existing in isolation from one another. But the issues each president deals with often began many years before him and continue many administrations after him. In the exhibits, conferences, and websites, the libraries now look to examine issues across what I like to call the timeline of the presidency. Examples of some of these studies include conquering outer space, the advancement of civil rights in America, the Vietnam War, and in this slide, I'm going to show some future documents and photographs from other administrations regarding the U.S. occupation of the Ryukyu Islands. This photograph happens to be, I think is a rather famous photograph, but it's from the collection of President Truman. Altogether, the presidential libraries hold about 8,000 cubic feet of photographs. Now, this is a document from the Lyndon Johnson administration. And if you look down here at the red, you can see that it's been declassified. The document is from Walt Rostow to the president, and in it, he is suggesting some political issues in Japan that had to deal with the Ryukyu Islands and what Prime Minister Sato needed in regard to a visit he was about to make. You know, it was important for the Prime Minister to be able to bring back an agreement from the U.S. So this memo is discussing that. There are many other memos in the file that detail the strategy and the concerns of the Japanese. Now, as far as the classified records go, I wanted you to know that in 1995, President Clinton issued an executive order requiring the declassification of all documents more than 25 years old, unless they were specifically exempted. This has led to very extensive review of the documents to identify the exemptions, because no one in the agencies or the bureaucracy trusted that a document should be automatically declassified after 25 years. The libraries, the presidential libraries, held 12 million classified pages more than 25 years old. And what we did was arrange to have all these classified documents scanned so they could be reviewed by employees of the various agencies like the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Department of Defense, the Department of State. They could review those back in Washington and notify the libraries of the action taken. We have until the end of 2013 to complete this review, and I think the libraries are all on track to have it completed. This is a page from President Johnson's diary that shows his meeting with Prime Minister Sato. It's the last entry here, the one that starts 6:59 p.m. We know from the notes of the meeting that they discussed the return of the Ryukyu Islands, and both, in a joint statement after the meeting, both the Prime Minister and the President agreed that they would reach an agreement, or the U.S. and Japan would reach an agreement within a few years, and they both agreed on the vital role of U.S. military bases in the security of Japan and the Far East. I want to tell you a little bit about what this is, this presidential diary. An employee of mine actually does this for each president and has been doing it since the Truman administration. She works in the White House and she maintains the diary. She uses source material from the President's secretary, the scheduler, the Secret Service, White House operators, and others to put together this detailed account of the President's day. And if you go to the Presidential Library websites, you will see many of these diaries are available online. But you can see, this shows, he was going to the Secretary's office and he was looking at some memos, and then he was hanging out in the Oval Office, and then he took a call from a friend from Texas, and then he took a call from the Secretary of Treasury, and then he went into the meeting with the Prime Minister. This is a picture of that meeting that took place in the Cabinet Room. You can see President Johnson and Walt Rostow and the Prime Minister with his staff. If we move forward about 5 years, it's now May of 1972. Sato is still the Prime Minister and Richard Nixon is President of the United States. These are cables that were exchanged on May 15th, 1972, across a new secure hotline between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon on the occasion of the return of Okinawa to Japan. These cables were the very first time that this new hotline was established. Now, a lot of people think the hotline was a phone line, but the hotline to Japan, the hotline to Russia were actually cable, secure cable transmissions. And this is Vice President Agnew at the ceremony on the return of the islands. Interestingly, I had an opportunity to visit the National Archives of Japan a couple of days ago, and they brought out this very same photograph. It was in an album that had been presented to Prime Minister Sato, and it was in the collection of the National Archives of Japan. I want to talk to you a little bit now about what we do at the end of an administration, or when a president's term of office is up. It's my office's responsibility to take possession of the records in the White House. This means cleaning out the White House, emptying the file cabinets, removing the hard drives from computers, transferring all the information that's on the servers. Because the Archivist of the United States, under the Presidential Records Act, takes custody at noon on January 20th, Inauguration Day of a new president, takes possession of the records. At the end of the Bush administration, we ingested, meaning that we transferred from one computer to our own computers, 100 million terabytes of data. We actually started that project in December of 2008 and had it largely completed by October of 2009. We worked with military to move the bulk of the physical records, and we transferred 30,000 cubic feet of records and 50,000 artifacts by planes and trucks to the temporary site of the library in Louisville, Texas. And the George W. Bush Library is being built on the campus of SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. This is a rendering of what the library will look like. Here we already, interestingly, have sites interested in pursuing the development of the Obama Library, both Hawaii and Chicago. And I don't know, I'm not taking any money on which one will win out. I do know that right after the election, I had people call me wanting to work in the Obama Presidential Library. I said, well, call me back in 4 or 8 years. But in building a library, you know, I've told you the foundations build the libraries, but they have to build them to standards established by the National Archives. And the standards really are quite daunting. They're more than 150 pages. So when we first present them to the architectural firm that's going to design the library, they can be quite overwhelmed. But the standards cover our authority to accept the library, our role in the approval of the design and construction of the library, the requirements for preservation and environmental standards, the kind of spaces that are needed in the library, and what building codes need to be met. We meet regularly with the architects all through the construction and design process. Then, once the building is completed, we certify that the building meets our standards and send a report to Congress. And after 60 days of lying before Congress, the library is then transferred to the National Archives. We expect this library to be completed in the spring of 2003. In this slide, I'm talking a little bit about the difference between presidential records and federal records. Presidential records are probably unique in the world in that they came into being after records had been presidential records for a long time were owned personally by the president. But what happened is Watergate. Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and he became involved in the crisis known as Watergate. And when he left office, there was concern by Congress that he would destroy the taped conversations and other records related to the offenses known as Watergate. And so Congress passed a law confiscating those records and making them the property of the federal government. A few years later, Congress decided, well, Richard Nixon was an example and that records should no longer be owned personally by the presidents, so they passed the Presidential Records Act. Records that are governmental are those that reflect the constitutional and statutory duties of the president. Now, what remains personal are, of course, private records, but then political records, records about the president's campaign or his political concerns are considered private. Now, that can create a lot of problems for us as archivists because the political and the governmental often overlap. And it's always been our position that the governmental records trump the ownership, and that if a record discusses governmental responsibilities as well as political, we retain the record. But the Presidential Records Act also provided some protections for the president and gave him certain rights over the records that federal agencies do not have in the federal world. The president has a right to question access to records and to require that they be closed under executive privilege for a period of time. And so that forces the review of every single page before we open it. Now, as I told you, we have 200 million email messages from George W. Bush. It's going to take a long time to review every single page. But over time, these restrictions lapse. executive privilege diminishes over time, and at some point, I believe that we will reach a stage where we basically declare victory and open all the records. I'm not sure what that date will be. Maybe it's 50 years, maybe it's 75 years. Hopefully it's not 100 years, but I know that we'll never be able to review 1 billion pieces of paper. It's a little bit out of order. I meant to show this after the picture of the Bush Library. This is David Ferriero at the groundbreaking of the George W. Bush Library. And these are 3 of the library directors, the director of the older Bush Library, the Ronald Reagan Library, and the Johnson Library. And there's me with a couple of my colleagues from Washington, D.C. at the groundbreaking of the George W. Bush Library. There were about 1,000 people there. Now I want to talk about the role of presidents with their libraries, especially as related to museum programs. In last year, in February of 2010, President Carter's library opened a new exhibit, and this is a photograph of President Carter showing all the library directors through the new museum. And the museum has a lot of highly interactive features. There are a lot of features meant to be attractive to children and educational. But I think the most important thing about the exhibit is that some, 30-odd years after President Carter left office, he was able to be far more reflective. And our director of that library worked with him on this exhibit to have it be as open and frank as at all possible. One of the things that's in the exhibit is a frank discussion of how President Carter felt when he left office. He didn't say that before in the older exhibit, but he did talk about being an angry man when he left office after the issues related to the hostage taken in Iran. And shortly after leaving office, in January of 1969, President Lyndon Johnson visited the 4 existing presidential libraries. This is 1969. There were only 4 of them: Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower. And after returning from the Hoover Library, President Johnson convened the library staff for the very first time in order to meet them and talk about his observations. Now, that's me sitting in the chair. I'd been at the library only about 2 weeks. The president walked around the room to introduce himself, and for each one of us to introduce ourselves to him. And it was most unfortunate that I'd chosen to sit in that chair because it was a swivel chair and I was very, very nervous. And in fact, after the meeting was over, my colleagues told me that this is what the president did while I was talking to him. He was moving his head back and forth as I swiveled back and forth in the chair, and I actually have no memory of doing that. But here is the president at the various libraries. He's visiting the Hoover Library and the Roosevelt Library. And one of the things for you to note about this was, as I said, this was in 1969. And at that time, really, the exhibits in the libraries were mostly about the display of documents and artifacts in cases. They really didn't offer much in the way of interpretive exhibit. It was just, nice things to look at when you went to the library. And here he is speaking at the Eisenhower Library. And on the far right, it's very interesting, he's jabbing his finger at President Truman. He's sitting in President Truman's office at the Truman Library. President Truman lived just down the hill from the library, and he would walk up there every day and visit with the people who were coming through the museum. So often people would find themselves chatting with President Truman. But here he is chatting with President Johnson. Now, this is back to that same meeting that we had in 1969. Interesting, you saw the other picture, it was all the women. Well, here it's mostly men gathered around the table, and you can see the president at the far end of the table looking at the gentleman behind him. And what he's saying there, and remember, when President Johnson left office, it was the height of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of controversy about the war. It was people shouting at him, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And he's telling us about his visit to the Hoover Library. And he said, you know, I found out at the Hoover Library that President Hoover was a great man. I just thought he caused the Depression. But I found out he was this terrific humanitarian. And he looked around the room at every single one of us, and he said, and that's what I want you to do for me. So he wanted us to make him a great man. It's all about legacy. But interestingly, today, and I started out at the LBJ Library, and I worked there 8 or 9 years, and I have colleagues who are still working at the library today, 42 years later, and we're actually very proud of our record of what we did for LBJ, but it's not what LBJ expected. His legacy came from the opening of his records, revealing behind the scenes what LBJ was able to accomplish. He was quite a master legislator. He was very conflicted about the war. His conversations show the depth of his own humanity, and I think that's what makes him a very interesting president and has helped him to claim a place as one of the better presidents in the United States, at least in some areas. Now, here's what LBJ did not learn about Herbert Hoover. You know, he had said, you know, I knew Herbert Hoover caused the Great Depression, and it was his fault, and he didn't do anything about it. Well, when he went to the museum back in 1969, he didn't see very much about the Great Depression in the museum, because as long as Herbert Hoover's children were living, they didn't really want to focus on that part of Herbert Hoover's life. And so today, we have in the museum a very different kind of exhibit. And by the way, this shows the humanitarian side of Herbert Hoover. One of the things that Hoover did after World War I was to organize a major relief effort in Belgium that saved hundreds of thousands of Belgians from starving to death because they were stuck between a blockade. And so those are flour sacks that were embroidered by grateful citizens of Belgium for his relief effort. And the other slide depicts part of the exhibit in the Hoover Library that shows a replica of a Belgian warehouse. But today, the exhibit is much more interpretive, and we have a very different and much more frank look at Hoover's role in the Great Depression. It's not unsympathetic, but it does point out that Hoover's complete failure to dramatize himself was his greatest strength as a humanitarian, but his greatest failure as a politician. And so it acknowledges his failure to connect with the American people on the Great Depression, or to really come up with a substantial program to overcome the Depression. Now, as we've evolved in our thinking about presidential library exhibits, we've become more responsive to criticism of our libraries. And this is a newspaper article in which Holocaust scholars demanded that we revise a display at the FDR Museum. Basically, the concern was that in our exhibit, we stated that even Roosevelt's bitterest critics could not believe that he could have done anything more to save the Jews from slaughter. Now, there is a major amount of debate among historians today who cite numerous steps that we could have taken, from granting refugees temporary haven, bombing the rails, pressing the British to open Palestine to refugees, and giving broader funding and power to the War Refugee Board. Others sometimes point out the isolationism and anti-Semitic sentiment on the home front would have prevented FDR from opening America's borders. But a president is the conscience of a nation, and it's up to a president to change the will of a nation in order to save people. And so our new caption is much more open about that and talks about our failures of preventing or saving more Jews during World War II. And this is just a little piece of the present exhibit, and the inscription here on the wall goes into more detail about President Roosevelt's role with the Holocaust. We're in the process of redoing the entire Roosevelt Museum. This was just one little display, but the whole museum is currently being refurbished. And the new display will be much more extensive about the Holocaust and more extensive about some of President Roosevelt's other failures, including his decision to intern Japanese Americans after the start of World War II. Of course, we're going to be celebrating his wonderful successes, the New Deal, and his role in World War II and on the military side. So, you know, it's achieving a balance in a library museum. Sometimes we deal with a lot of controversial exhibits, and this exhibit at the Truman Library is an example of how, you know, 40, 50 years after a president leaves office, we've had a lot of historical interpretation going on. You know, when a president first leaves office, there are people who liked him, and there are people who didn't like him. And it's pretty partisan. And we haven't had enough time, enough historical interpretation to really judge whether the president was successful or not, whether his decisions were wise ones. And so in this display about the decision to drop the atomic bomb in Japan, we go over many aspects of the president's decision, but we also look at criticisms of the president's decision, including this particular inscription that that goes on to say that let me say this, that for a long time in America, it was felt that, and this is what we were taught, that's what I was taught when I was in school, that dropping the bomb saved American lives, and it was very important to do that. But historians don't look at it that way now. And a lot of historians are examining all the evidence that's come out from records that have been declassified. And this particular quote talks about, I'll just read a little portion of it. It's certainly the case that we Americans have been badly served by our leaders, that we were systematically misled about many of the basic facts. An entire generation of soldiers were taught that their lives were saved by the atomic bomb. Many historians now see that the end of the war was inevitable without the bomb. And so this is just one of the historians, and we have different views of different historians on the wall in that exhibit. Now, it's not always easy to be this frank about our exhibits because they're largely paid for by the Presidential Library Foundations. And the foundations are an important part of a presidential library. It's a public-private partnership, and the management of the museum is joint governance. So in large part, it's my role to help to educate foundations about the need to openly discuss the complete legacy of the president, both his challenges and his successes, because that's how we learn in our country to govern and to learn from our mistakes. But the foundations are important. They raise a lot of money for the libraries, and there can be a lot of tension over the issues of legacy, history, and politics in this relationship, because the library's view of our stewardship of public history can be in conflict with the foundation's stewardship of the president's legacy. But, you know, we've made progress. The new exhibits at Roosevelt, Bush 41, Truman, and Carter are examples of how the partnership is working at its best. And a key for me and for the foundation is to understand where the library is in its life cycle. If it's a brand new library, if it's just opening up, that exhibit is basically a memoir of the president. It's in exhibit form, but it's how the president looked at his administration. And as time passed, and as we open the records and we can judge the historical documents and see the interpretation of different historians and others, we can write a different kind of exhibit, and that's what we look to do in presidential libraries. But a key factor for me in working with the foundations is to let them know that historical balance does not come or does not need to come at the expense of the legacy of the president. No president ever assumed office intending to do a bad job. The 44 men who have been president of the United States did their best under often very harrowing circumstances. There should be celebratory exhibits in Presidential Museum, and there should be examinations that look at critical moments from multiple perspectives, including the president's. This is the most remarkable legacy that any president can leave. As President Johnson said when he opened his museum, it's all here with the bark off. This is the Richard Nixon Library, and I think internally in our country, the most controversial exhibit we've ever done is the Watergate exhibit. You know, as I told you, Nixon's papers were confiscated by the federal government, and the Nixon Library was built privately and operated privately for nearly 17 years before it was turned over to the government. And only then, after Congress passed a law that allowed us to move the records from the DC area to Yorba Linda, California, where this library is located. But one requirement in the government taking over the operation of the library was that the Watergate exhibit be replaced. The original Watergate exhibit had basically skipped over a lot of the evidence about President Nixon's role in the cover-up of Watergate. In fact, they actually played an excerpt from what we know in our country as the smoking gun tape, and they played it in such a way and excerpted it in such a way that it looked like the president was not guilty of any wrongdoing, whereas if you listen to the whole tape, you could actually reveal, it actually reveals that President Nixon was trying to get the CIA to thwart the FBI's investigation. This is the new Watergate exhibit, and it uses the documentary record to highlight specific events. Here it talks about dirty tricks and political espionage and the cover-up and break-in and evidence. Now, when we were doing this exhibit, we never would have used the term dirty tricks in a presidential library, except that it was a phrase used by Nixon himself on the tapes. So this exhibit is based on the documentary evidence, but we wanted to have viewers look at that, but ask questions about the context of the times. Did President Nixon go further than any other American president? After all, there had been a long history of dirty tricks in American politics going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. How did the turmoil of the 60s and early 70s surrounding the Vietnam War impact Nixon's actions? And in fact, he was very concerned about the leaking of classified information. Remember, the Pentagon Papers had been published, and so that was a part of his concern. Did Nixon know about the break-in at Democratic headquarters in the Watergate? And the answer to that question is probably not. There is no evidence that he knew anything about the break-in, but the evidence is very strong that he knew about the cover-up. You know, I think it's just too bad he didn't stand up and admit to it, and I think it all would have blown over, but he got involved in the cover-up. Did Watergate change how we look at presidential power? And yes, it certainly did. It changed how the media functions in regard to president. All scandals now have the term gate attached to it, and so Watergate had a major impact on American politics. You know, it's hard to have this kind of exhibit in a presidential library, but Nixon was forced to resign. But I think we want to do an exhibit on Nixon's post-presidential life that talks about his role as an elder statesman. His role, you know, he was very wise when it came to foreign affairs and foreign relations. And I think that it's a lesson for children who come to the library. You can make a major mistake in your life. I mean, such a bad mistake that you have to resign the presidency of the United States. But you pick up and you go on with your life, and you find a way to find value in your life. And I think that's an important lesson for children, and that's why we want to really focus on President Nixon's post-presidential life next. So I've talked about the, you know, what we're striving to do in presidential library museums. We did a survey a couple of years ago, and if you look at the far left-hand column, the first column here, the others are broken down by individual libraries. First, we want to make sure, you know, we want to know that people coming to our museums and learning something they didn't know before. And so we got 95% of people who visit say they agree or strongly agree that they learned something new. I think the other 5% must have been history professors. Then on the lower number, we want to know if people thought our exhibits were presented in a balanced manner. And here our percentages: 86% agree or strongly agree that it's fairly balanced. So I think those are pretty good numbers considering how partisan we are in America these days. And this just shows that 97% of our visitors felt that we exceeded or met their expectations. The libraries are very experimental, and you know, when I began my career in presidential libraries, we were all about serving scholars, and that is still a most important part of our mission. About 20,000 researchers a year visit our library. 3/4 of our staff in the libraries are archivists, and they work with professional researchers. Many of you in the audience may have been to a library. I know Professor here has been to a presidential library. So that's important, but not everyone will grow up to be a scholar, and not everyone will actually work in a research room and look at records. So we've wanted to be important in helping children discover the importance of records, the importance of our democracy, and the importance of government, and to be a part of government. And in these slides, you see students role-playing activities in the libraries. On the left are students at the Eisenhower Library getting ready for the D-Day invasion. And interestingly, meteorologists played a major role at the D-Day invasion because of the weather factor, and it was unknown whether the invasion would go forward or not. And at least 2 students have graduated from school and gone on to careers in meteorology because of this exercise. And on the right are students at the Truman Library role-playing one of several activities. I'm not sure which one. They could be looking at the recognition of Israel, or the decision to integrate the armed forces, or the Berlin airlift, or the decision to drop the atomic bomb. But we have many programs like this across the presidential library system. And the interesting thing is students come out of that program and they say things like, being president is much harder than it looks like on TV. I hope that students who go through these programs when they come of age, actually turn out to vote, because that's how democracy works, and that's what I would be most proud of if that's the case. This was a great moment in my career. I think when people ask me, you know, what's a highlight, I remember a few years ago, 2007, it was the 50th anniversary of the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Eisenhower sent in troops to help the original, the 9 brave students integrate Central High School. And this is a reunion of those 9 students. They're at the Clinton Library. They're with President Clinton, and he is showing them the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, freeing the slaves, and telling them about not only the importance of that document, but the importance of their role. So it was a really intimate moment in the room, watching him talk to the original Little Rock 9. On the other side are just tourists at the library looking at the emancipation. We had, on that occasion, we brought students from Abilene High School. Abilene is where the Eisenhower Library is. And we had students from Central High School, and they role-played the whole decision. Some were playing the segregationists, some were playing military, some were playing the students, some were playing the local government. Here they are debriefing the exercise, and what I really enjoyed about it was listening to their very interesting discussion of the meaning of the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And I found not many adults can speak as well as they did about what that clause means. And this is just, I think, one example of how we in presidential libraries promote civic literacy. This is just a picture from the Carter Library Museum, the new exhibit that shows the use of technology. And one reason why exhibits are so expensive now, this is an iTable that students use to follow Jimmy Carter around the world in his post-presidency. This table cost $1 million. And now a typical new exhibit in a presidential library is somewhere between $10 and $15 million, mostly because of technology. The future of presidential libraries. Congress is frequently concerned about the cost of presidential libraries. Now, it always comes up in a sort of a partisan climate. Some congressmen will raise concern. In the end, we are often asked to write reports about how we can have a centralized library system or how we can have libraries that cost less. But presidential libraries continue to happen, and I think that's because there are a lot of people in Congress who would like to have a presidential library of their own someday. The last time we had to write a report was in 2009, and we discussed several different models for a presidential library. They included, well, one thing that's happened in Model 1, the cost of the endowment for presidential libraries. When a presidential library is given to the government, the foundation is required to provide an endowment to offset the cost of the library. That endowment today is 60% of the cost of the library. And so I think that's major what will happen in presidential libraries. More and more money will come from the foundations to support the continuation of the library. The other models, I think, particularly highlight Model 4. Model 4 is a centralized model. It costs the least to operate that we figured the cost over a 75-year timeline. But while it may cost the least, it has the greatest startup costs because we figured it would cost about $100 million to build a new facility. And in our budget environment, it would be very difficult to get $100 million. And Model 5 was the same as Model 4, except that it also included a museum. Because of the report that we did on centralizing the presidential libraries, we did a follow-up report on some of the innovations in the libraries. The libraries have been leaders in the National Archives in many different ways. We took the first centralized approach to declassification. And I think some of you may have heard Michael Kurtz, who was here a couple of years ago, talking about the National Declassification Center. Well, that's been modeled after the program that we developed in presidential libraries for declassifying classified records. We also had the first automated description tool in the National Archives. And because we have 90% of the electronic records, we're the leaders in processing electronic records. And we created the first websites. We had a website before the rest of the National Archives did at Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Johnson, and Bush. We've also been pioneers in developing education programs, and I encourage you to look at our websites. We have many of these educational materials online and available. We're able to digitize many of the records, and I think some of you might have questions about digitization, and I'll be happy to answer them in the question and answer session. But we have spent a lot of private funds to support digitization efforts. C-SPAN is a television network in the U.S. that broadcasts public programming, and the presidential libraries are often featured in C-SPAN. I was getting on a plane one day, and the woman sitting across the aisle from me kept staring at me. She said, I know you, I know you. And I looked at her, I didn't know her, and I said, you don't happen to watch C-SPAN, do you? And she said, yes, yes, I do. I said, well, you're a C-SPAN junkie. We have hundreds of interns that come to our libraries each year, and the Clinton Library was the very first existing federal building to achieve the LEED Platinum level. And it has a green roof on top of the Clinton Library, and President Clinton has an apartment on the top of the building. He likes to go out on the green roof. We put in a putting green for him, or the foundation did. We didn't. The archives didn't do it. The foundation did it. So he likes to go out on the roof of the library and shoot golf balls. But what is important now about presidential libraries, and what I realized when I came into the job 15 years ago, the system was growing, and the libraries couldn't continue to be individual standalone libraries. They needed to work together. And so over the past 15 years, I've worked with the libraries to identify that strong sense of mission and to understand the synergy of a library system. And we did that around our shared mission, which involves protecting and preserving the records, our commitment to articulating the historical challenges and the successes of each president, and our ability to provide visitors both an online and an in-person link to their history. We've also all agreed on the importance of emerging from our past as elitist scholarly institutions, that we have a role with students, that scholars are always important, but if we're going to make an impact on society, we really need to reach out to students, and that's why we have all the education programs that we have. We also know that if we cooperate together, we can really address the issues that have troubled America for years and years, and maybe help to figure out ways of finding solutions by bringing people together to discuss those issues. We share in the development of costs. We do exhibits together now. We have a traveling exhibit right now called Schoolhouse to White House that tells the story of the education of presidents. And I bring the staff together on a regular basis. We have all the archivists come to town, or all the supervisory archivists, all of the curators, the education specialists. We meet together to discuss best practices, common concerns, and find solutions to problems. People wonder, what about a virtual presidential library? all the records are electronic. Do you need to have a presidential library? Well, we do still have paper records, and we probably will for another administration or two. But times change quickly, and I imagine in the next 12 to 15, 16 years, the records will be almost completely electronic. But I don't think that means that we shouldn't have a presidential library. There will still be a few paper records with great intrinsic value that we'll want to keep together. Presidents will still receive gifts, and there'll still be memorabilia in the libraries. But I think the most important reason for continuing to have a library is the need to house the staff that will work on the petabytes, or even beyond that. I don't even know what comes after a petabyte. Beyond that, of digital material created in each administration. Because only a knowledgeable and skilled staff can apply the restrictions and review the records and help scholars and the public sort through this mountain of information. It's not something that anyone can do alone. One of the strengths of the current system is that it strikes, I think, the right balance between centralization and decentralization. Each library is built in a location determined by the president and his family. In visiting them, one is immersed in the locale in which the president lived and matured politically. Walking the streets of Grand Rapids, Michigan, one understands the quiet dignity of Gerald Ford. Visitors understand the impetus of LBJ's War on Poverty differently after traveling through Texas and then reading in the Johnson Library, and this is Johnson right here with his students, reading in the Johnson Library the letter LBJ wrote to his mother securing 200 toothbrushes and tubes of toothpaste for the Mexican-American students he taught as a young man in the segregated South Texas town. And that's that picture right there. It has been an honor for me to work in presidential libraries. I began just over 42 years ago and will retire next Friday. Ours is a young country without great temples and imperial palaces. I feel honored to have played a small part in telling a portion of America's story to the students and citizens of the United States and the world who visit our museums from Tallahassee to Tokyo, Dallas to Dakar. These people come to our libraries and searching to understand the history of our nation and our world. This is, for me, why we undertake the work of preserving and providing access to the priceless historical treasures that touch our memories. The creation of a presidential library by those who have served as president demonstrates one of the underlying and essential elements of democratic government. Citizens must understand how their government works and have access to the documents that define their past. So I pass the baton on to the next generation. I have a couple of the next generation standing. It's my son and grandson standing in front of the records at the LBJ Library. When I was a young archivist, we moved into the building, and I don't know if you can see it, but all those boxes had gold seals on them. So in the daytime, we'd be sticking the gold seals on the boxes, and we'd come in the next day, and the seals had fallen off, and they were on the floor. What were we going to do? We consulted with glue experts from around the world because they were supposed to be self-sticking. In the end, do you know what we used? Elmer's glue. And they're still sticking on today. So anyway, I thank you very much. You're a wonderful audience. I hope you have lots of questions for me because we have more time. Thank you.
FDR、ルーズベルト大統領図書館の展示を私見たんですけど、展示を見た時ですね、日本の悪口っていうのは全くなかったんですね。私は非常に驚きました。ドイツの悪口に関してはたくさんありました。日本の悪口何にもなかったんで、なぜなんだろうと考えたらウォーカー郵政長官ですね、が展示に協力したと。でウォーカーっていうのは 日米開戦を避けようとして非常に努力した人なんですね。そういうのが展示ですから、どうしても展示自体に政治性があるかもしれませんが、その資料を出すことによってですね、そういうなんていうのか政治的にこの解釈っていうののブレをですね狭める働きがあるんじゃないかと私は思っています。アメリカでもですねフランクリン・ルーズベルト大統領に対しては非常に両極端な意見があります。日本で言えば総じて非常に悪い意見があります。だけど私のように、私はもうごく少数派なんですけど FDR は非常に日本に対して親切だったという私だけなんですけども、私だけか知りませんが私はごく少数派なんですね。でも資料を読んでるから堂々と言えるんですよ。ですから大統領図書館の中立性という問題もあるけど、資料を出すことによってですねそのブレの幅を少なくするということはできると思うんですね。それが資料の公開の大切さだと私は思っています。すみません、私が答えてしまった。ファッツさん、何かご意見ございますでしょうか。
Oh, yes. In fact, it occurred to me that, we have some wonderful colleagues here in the American Resource Centers, and they could be bridges towards building these links because they're aware of all of you and your resources, and maybe we can connect together. In fact, I think you're coming to Washington in a few weeks to meet with all the librarians, and this could be sort of a project that could get underway because I think it would be very, very useful. Yes.
九州大学大学院の
入ってる
ライブラリーサイエンス専攻の、清原と申します。今日の話は非常に興味深く聞かせていただきました。というのはこの大統領図書館の、記録を残すという側面だけではなくてそれを、先ほどの議論もありましたけれども歴史的な視点から展示をしたりですね、その展示の仕方っていうのも時代とともに多様な解釈を入れながら変化してきたっていう話もありました。そして未来の子どもたちへの教育っていう側面も話されたかと思います。そういう意味で非常に興味深かったんですけれども、解釈をいろいろ議論に開いていくっていう部分が今後大事ではないかなと思っておりまして、教育プログラムっていうのは、具体的にどういうことがなされているのかっていうのを一つお聞きしたいと思います。
はい、わかりました。教育プログラムに絞ってお答えしてもらうのです。
Well, we have educational programs directed at young students. I showed you some of them, the decision center, the role-playing exercises. We bring teachers into workshops every summer. Each library holds 2 or 3 workshops for teachers to show them how students can use primary source documents. But then we also have public programs for adults. And these can range from individual speakers, authors who've written books, who come and talk about their books, folks who were in the president's administration come and talk about their experience. We have conferences and symposiums. One of the most interesting conferences we had was on the Vietnam War. We had it right after the Iraq War broke out. We brought together journalists, people from the previous administrations, like Henry Kissinger was there. We had historians there, and we had a 2-day conference. And it really was eye-opening to listen to the comparisons between Vietnam and Iraq. We didn't start out having the conference that way, but it was a real experience to think about the lessons learned in Vietnam and how they might apply to Iraq. So we do those kind of programs a lot. And many of them are broadcasts on C-SPAN. And in fact, you can go to the C-SPAN website and they archive all these programs and see them. So those are some of the types of educational programs we have for our audiences.
九州大学の大学院の、ライブラリーサイエンス専攻に所属しています山口と申します。今日は貴重なお話が聞けて大変勉強になりました。お話をずっと聞く中でやはりその大統領図書館の機能としてその大統領のそういう政策やそういう人柄とかをいろいろとその一般的な人々にも伝えることでその国民としての意識というものを高める機能もあるのかなと。有権者の意識を高めて自分たちが大統領を選ぶんだっていう意識を高めるそういう機能も備わってるんだなということを感じました。またその、実際にその日本での図書館の、定義というのはそのアメリカとは違うと感じていましてそのここでの一応大統領図書館というふうに名称としてはついてますがとてもその公文書館や博物館としての機能の方が強く出ていてそれでもその図書館というふうな名称がついているというのはその、もちろん大統領のこの威厳を保つという面もあるのかもしれないんですけどそのアメリカにおけるその図書館の定義というのが広いのかなというふうにもちょっと自分で感じた部分がありました。
ありがとうございます。はい。
Actually, the term library does not have a wider meaning in the United States. It means exactly what it means here. And my library directors really dislike that they're called presidential libraries because a lot of people don't know there's a museum there. So in most cases, I think in all cases now, we talk about the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library and Museum, so that people understand that there is also a museum there. But it is a very confusing term. People come into the libraries all the time and say, where are the books? You know, and you show them the boxes. And they say, well, those aren't books, those are boxes. And we've actually incorporated, as you can see in this photograph here, we've tried to incorporate in several of the libraries the archives into the display to help people understand what's in the collection. Interestingly, with technology, one of the cool things we have in a couple of the libraries and in the National Archives in Washington, we have a display of archival boxes, and then we have a computer screen, and on that computer screen, you can see displayed some of the documents that are in the box. And the visitor can scroll through a number of documents on a particular subject and understand what it is that's in the archival collection. You know, I don't know if you have this problem in Japan, but when I was, first became an archivist and I told people what I did, I always had to explain it because I don't know whether this will make sense in the translation, but all of these things start with an A in English. They thought I was an anarchist. They thought I was an architect, and or an art. And I remember when Don Wilson was sworn in as Archivist of the United States, someone called and congratulated him on being the new Archbishop of the United States. So that's a very confusing profession to have when you have to explain. It's sort of like a librarian, but not exactly.
本日は貴重なお話をありがとうございました。九州大学のライブラリーサイエンスの田中と申します。最後の締めくくり、
はい、簡潔明瞭にお願いします。
すみません、最後にふさわしいかどうかわからないんですけども、大統領の政権終了後に資料をすべて回収して整理するということでしたが、そういったものは何名ぐらいで資料を整理しているのかということと、そういった人材はその専門職であるアーキビストとかが関わっているのかとか、パートタイムの人も含まれているのかなど、どういったメンバーでどういった作業を行っているのかを少し教えていただければと思います。
Well, on the records themselves, I have a staff of about 15 archivists and technicians that work in Washington, D.C., the downtown building. But that's not enough people to transfer the records at the end of administration. So we borrow people from all over the National Archives to help with that. And in the end, we probably have around 50 or 60 archivists supporting the move. But it's not just archivists that are involved in a presidential transition. We have to stand up or build a whole temporary facility to house the records. So we create that temporary facility in the town where the library is being built. In the case of the George W. Bush Library, it was a former Siemens telephone factory that's in a warehouse area, and that's been converted to an archival storage and office area where the records are stored until the library is built. So that's part of the project of moving a presidential library. We also need support from the military. We had about 25 soldiers assigned to us to work in the White House, and they did the heavy lifting, you know, packing up the carts and crates that go onto the airplanes, and the trucks that are transporting the records to, in this case, Texas. So it's a huge team to support a transition. That's why in my office, we always vote for the incumbent president. It took 2 years to plan the Bush move. If President Obama loses, well, I'll be retired, but if he should lose, they only have about 100 days to plan the transition. And no president wants to talk to us during their first term about a presidential library, because I think they see it as a jinx. If they talked about it, well, it would mean that they might lose the election. So we always hope that the incumbent president, no matter what our politics are, that stays in office.
ファセット先生、どうも今日もありがとうございました。2時間にわたり。じゃあ拍手を持って終わりたいと思います。
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
それで番外編でまだ5分ほどありますが、予定がなかった。多分館長、なんか一言最後に言わなくてよろしいですか。一言どうぞ。5分ある、もうごく短い、なんか一言、はい。準備ないでしょうけど、一言、一言美男子に出てもらわないと。はい。
皆様本当に今日はありがとうございました。もう金曜日の夜遅くなってますが、この話は、私たちにもアメリカンセンターのものにもすごく面白かったと思います。そして私たちが先ほど少し先生も申し上げたように資料室がありますから、アメリカに関する質問がほとんど何でもうちの学能が答えることができますので、ぜひ、インパーソンでも、Eメールでも電話でも、聞いてください。本当にアメリカの情報を、公開するのは私たちの、ここにアメリカンセンターある目的ですので、ぜひご利用ください。じゃあ最後でした。本当に皆さんありがとうございました。よろしくお願いします。
じゃあこれで終わりますので、帰りは喧嘩せずにお帰りください。混み合いますので。じゃあどうもありがとうございました。これで終わります。